It was a sunny afternoon at Lax, and the airport was buzzing with its usual chaos. Among the crowd of travelers was a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed, confident, and with an air of self-importance that made him stand out. Let's call him Rick. He had just secured an upgrade to first class on his flight to New York and couldn't wait to flaunt it. After all, Rick considered himself someone who deserved the finer things in life. As the boarding announcement rang out, Rick strutted down the jet bridge like he owned the airline, his designer carry-on rolling behind him. He quickly settled into his plush first-class seat, ordered a drink before takeoff, and began scrolling through his phone, looking around occasionally to size up the other passengers. He loved first class, not just for the comfort, but for the status it gave him. Rick thrived on that. It wasn't long before another passenger entered the first-class cabin, someone older, dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans. He moved with a kind of unassuming grace you'd only notice if you were paying close attention. Rick glanced up briefly, barely giving the man a second thought, until he noticed something familiar about him. The man had sharp, weathered features and a pair of piercing eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. But Rick quickly dismissed the thought. Just another old guy with money, he muttered under his breath, turning back to his phone. As the man took his seat a few rows ahead, Rick noticed that several of the flight attendants seemed unusually attentive to him. They smiled more warmly, spoke softly, and one even asked if there was anything specific he'd like before the flight began. Rick couldn't help but roll his eyes. Great, another entitled old rich guy who thinks he owns the world, he thought. The flight attendants began their safety briefing, but Rick was barely listening. His focus shifted back to the older man, who now had a book open in his lap. The man's calm demeanor annoyed Rick for some reason, maybe because it contrasted so sharply with Rick's own restless energy. Or maybe it was just the way everyone seemed to treat him like he was someone important. Rick leaned over to the passenger next to him, a woman who seemed equally curious about the man, and whispered, "Who does this guy think he is, anyway? The king of first class." The woman chuckled politely but didn't respond. Rick wasn't done, though. He was already forming a story in his mind about who this man must be, a retired CEO, some kind of Silicon Valley big shot, maybe even old money from some family dynasty. The possibilities annoyed Rick even more. About halfway through the flight, as the cabin settled into a quiet hum, Rick noticed the man standing near the galley. He was speaking with one of the flight attendants, and both of them were smiling as if they were old friends. That was Rick's breaking point. Fueled by a couple of complimentary cocktails and his own sense of entitlement, Rick decided he needed to take this mysterious man down a peg. He stood up, stretched dramatically, and walked over to the galley where the man was standing. With a forced grin, Rick said, "Hey there, enjoying the first-class treatment? Must be nice to have everyone fawning over you." His tone was light, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. The man looked at Rick, his expression calm and unreadable. "It's a nice flight," he replied simply, his voice low and steady. Rick smirked, feeling emboldened. "Yeah, I bet it is. You must be someone pretty special, huh? What's the deal? Are you some kind of celebrity or something?" The flight attendant, sensing the tension, tried to step in. "Sir, is there something I can get for you?" she asked Rick, but he waved her off. "No, I'm good. Just curious about our VIP here," Rick said, gesturing toward the man. "Seems like everyone knows him except me." The older man set down his drink and looked Rick square in the eye. There was a flicker of something, amusement, maybe, or perhaps pity, but his face remained composed. "I wouldn't say I'm a VIP," he said with a small shrug. "Just someone trying to get from point A to point B like everyone else." Rick wasn't satisfied with the answer. He crossed his arms and leaned in slightly. "Come on, you can't fool me. People don't just act like this for no reason. Who are you really? What's your story?" The man's gaze didn't waver, but before he could respond, the flight attendant spoke up. "Sir," she said, her tone firmer now, "I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat." Rick hesitated, but he knew he was starting to push his luck. With a dramatic sigh, he turned and walked back to his seat, muttering, "Probably just some washed-up actor trying to relive his glory days." The cabin returned to its quiet rhythm, but Rick couldn't let it go. He kept glancing at the man, waiting for some kind of reveal, some proof that his suspicions were right. What Rick didn't realize was that the truth was about to come out, and it was nothing like what he had imagined. As the flight began its descent into New York, the captain came on the intercom to thank the passengers and share a special announcement, and that's when everything changed. As the captain's voice filled the cabin, Rick barely paid attention at first. He was too busy scrolling through his phone, looking up news stories and photos of old Hollywood actors, trying to figure out who the older man might be. But then the captain said something that caught everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger on today's flight. It's not every day that we have the privilege of sharing the skies with a true icon. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Clint Eastwood, who is traveling with us today." Rick's jaw dropped. He froze, his phone slipping from his hand and landing softly on his lap. The name echoed in his head. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood. Suddenly, everything clicked. The rugged face, the calm demeanor, the way the flight attendants seemed so starstruck yet respectful. A ripple of whispers moved through the first-class cabin as passengers turned to look at the man who had been sitting quietly in his seat for most of the flight. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and filmmaker, whose career spanned decades and whose movies had defined entire generations. He was a living legend, and Rick had just made a complete fool of himself. Rick's heart started to race. He replayed the exchange in the galley over and over in his mind. The sarcasm, the smug attitude, the way he'd practically demanded to know who Clint Eastwood thought he was. Rick felt his face flush with embarrassment. How could he have been so clueless? Meanwhile, Clint remained composed. He nodded politely to the few passengers who smiled or waved at him, but didn't seem fazed by the announcement. If anything, he looked slightly amused, as if he'd seen this kind of reaction 100 times before, and he probably had. Rick slouched in his seat, wishing he could disappear. But the embarrassment wasn't over yet. The woman sitting next to him leaned over and whispered, "Well, I guess now you know who he is, huh?" Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was clear she'd overheard his earlier comments. Rick forced a laugh. "Yeah, I guess I do," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. As the plane began its final descent, Rick's mind raced. Should he apologize? Try to make amends? Or would that just make things worse? He couldn't decide. Part of him wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened, but another part knew he'd never forgive himself if he didn't at least try to set things right. By the time the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Rick had made up his mind. He waited until the seatbelt sign turned off and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Clint stood up, reaching for his modest carry-on bag, and Rick seized the moment. He stood too and cleared his throat nervously. "Ah, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Clint turned to him, his expression calm but curious. "Yes." Rick swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For earlier. I didn't realize who you were, and I was out of line. I feel like an idiot." Clint studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Rick felt a wave of relief, but Clint wasn't done. "You know," Clint added, "it's not about who I am or what I've done. Everyone deserves a little kindness and respect. Doesn't matter if they're famous or not." Rick nodded quickly. "You're absolutely right. I shouldn't have acted the way I did. Lesson learned." Clint gave him a faint smile, then turned and walked toward the exit. Rick watched him go, feeling a mix of relief and regret. Relief that Clint Eastwood hadn't completely written him off as a jerk, and regret that he hadn't figured out the truth sooner. As Rick grabbed his bag and filed off the plane, he couldn't stop thinking about Clint's words. Kindness and respect. They sounded so simple, Yet Rick realized how often he'd let his ego get in the way of treating people the way they deserved. In the terminal, Rick saw Clint one last time. The older man was walking toward a group of fans who had clearly been waiting for him. Despite his age, Clint's presence was magnetic. He greeted each person with a warm smile, signing autographs and taking photos without a hint of impatience or annoyance. Rick lingered for a moment, watching from a distance. It struck him that Clint Eastwood, a man who had every reason to act entitled, carried himself with more humility and grace than Rick ever had. It was a humbling realization. As Rick walked toward the baggage claim, he made a silent promise to himself. From that day forward, he would try to live up to the lesson Clint Eastwood had so effortlessly demonstrated, that true greatness isn't about power or status, but about how you treat others, no matter who they are. But as Rick disappeared into the crowd, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. Of all the people to insult on a first-class flight, it had to be Clint Eastwood. Would you like me to keep going and wrap up the conclusion, or adjust anything so far? Rick moved through the airport terminal with a sense of quiet reflection, his mind still replaying the events of the flight. He couldn't believe how close he'd come to making an even bigger fool of himself, insulting Clint Eastwood. He could only imagine how that could have spiraled if Clint hadn't been as calm and gracious as he was. Rick kept thinking about the way Clint had handled everything, with patience, dignity, and not a single ounce of arrogance. It wasn't just impressive, it was inspiring. As Rick approached baggage claim, a realization began to sink in. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself, trying to appear important, that he'd forgotten what really mattered. It wasn't about the luxury seats, the expensive clothes, or making a scene to stand out. What truly mattered was character, the kind of inner strength and humility that Clint Eastwood had shown without even trying. Just as Rick was about to grab his suitcase, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw the woman who had been sitting next to him on the plane. She was holding her phone and smiling. "You know," she said, "you should probably write this day down. Not many people get a personal life lesson from Clint Eastwood." Rick laughed nervously. "Yeah, I don't think I'll forget it anytime soon," he said. She grinned. "Well, at least you owned up to it. Most people wouldn't even do that. It's something." Rick nodded, appreciating her words more than she probably realized. "Thanks," he said. "I'm just glad he didn't rip me to shreds." She laughed. "I think Clint Eastwood's a little too classy for that." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before going their separate ways, but her words stuck with Rick as he left the airport. Maybe that was the real takeaway from all of this, that it wasn't too late to change. He didn't have to keep being the guy who let his ego lead the way. He could choose to be better. As Rick drove away from the airport, he couldn't help but smile. The whole situation was almost too surreal to believe. It would make a great story someday, how he'd unknowingly insulted one of the greatest actors of all time and walked away with more than just embarrassment. He'd walked away with a new perspective. And for Clint Eastwood, he probably didn't think twice about the encounter. For him, it was just another moment in a long life full of remarkable stories. But for Rick, it was a turning point, one he wouldn't waste. By the time Rick got home, he had made a decision. From now on, he'd focus less on impressing others and more on being a person worth respecting. And who knows? Maybe one day he'd have a story of his own that was worth telling. One where he wasn't the guy who insulted Clint Eastwood, but someone who lived with the kind of grace and humility he had learned from the legend himself. As Rick stepped into his apartment, he set his suitcase down and glanced at the mirror by the door. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel a need to puff up his chest or put on a show. Instead, he smiled, just a simple, honest smile. Because while the flight had ended, his journey was just beginning. And this time, he was determined to make it count.